No sooner did Sister Emmerich recommence the narrative of her visions on the Passion than she again became extremely ill, oppressed with fever, and so tormented by violent thirst that her tongue was perfectly parched and contracted. And on the Monday after Mid-Lent Sunday, she was so exhausted that it was not without great difficulty, and after many intervals of rest, that she narrated all which our Lord suffered in his crowning with thorns. When Jesus was led into the guardhouse, they all cried out again, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" A gallery encircled the inner court of the guardhouse where our Lord was crowned with thorns, and the doors were open. The cowardly ruffians, who were eagerly waiting to gratify their cruelty by tormenting and insulting our Lord, were about 50 in number, and the greater part slaves or servants of the jailers and soldiers. The mob gathered round the building, but were soon displaced by 1,000 Roman soldiers who were drawn up in good order and stationed there. Although forbidden to leave their ranks, these soldiers nevertheless did their utmost by laughter and applause to incite the cruel executioners to redouble their insults. And as public applause gives fresh energy to a comedian, so did their words of encouragement increase tenfold the cruelty of these men. Then they tore off the garments of Jesus, thereby reopening all of his wounds, threw over his shoulder an old scarlet mantle which barely reached his knees, dragged him to the seat prepared, and pushed him roughly down upon it, having first placed the crown of thorns upon his head. The crown of thorns was made of 3 branches plaited together, the greatest part of the thorns being purposely turned inward so as to pierce our Lord's head. Having first placed these twisted branches on his forehead, they tied them tightly together at the back of his head, and no sooner was this accomplished to their satisfaction than they put a large reed into his hand, doing all with derisive gravity as if they were really crowning him king. They then seized the reed and struck him so violently that his eyes were filled with blood. They knelt before him, derided him, spat in his face, and buffeted him, saying at the same time, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Then they threw down his stool, pulled him up again from the ground on which he had fallen, and reseated him with the greatest possible brutality. It is quite impossible to describe the cruel outrages which were brought of and perpetrated by these monsters under human form. The sufferings of Jesus from thirst, caused by the fever which his wounds and sufferings had brought on, were intense. He trembled all over, his flesh was torn piecemeal, his tongue contracted, and the only refreshment he received was the blood which trickled from his head onto his parched lips. This shameful scene was protracted a full half-hour, and the Roman soldiers continued during the whole time to applaud and encourage perpetration of still greater outrages. The cruel executioners then reconducted our Lord to Pilate's palace, with the scarlet cloak still thrown over his shoulders, the crown of thorns on his head, and the reed in his fettered hands. He was perfectly unrecognizable, his eyes, mouth, and beard being covered with blood, his body but one wound, and his back bowed down as that of an aged man, while every limb trembled as he walked. When Pilate saw him standing at the entrance of his tribunal, even he, hard-hearted as he usually was, started and shuddered with horror and compassion, while these barbarous priests and the populace, far from being moved to pity, continued their insults and mockery. When Jesus had ascended the stairs, Pilate came forward. The trumpet was sounded to announce that the governor was about to speak, and he addressed the chief priests and the bystanders in the following words: "Behold, I bring him forth to you, that you may know that I find no cause in him." The archers then led Jesus up to Pilate, that the people might again feast their cruel eyes on him in the state to which he was reduced. Terrible and heartrending indeed was the spectacle he presented, and an exclamation of horror burst from the multitude, followed by a dead silence, when he with difficulty raised his wounded head, crowned as it was with thorns, and cast his exhausted glance on the excited throng. Pilate exclaimed as he pointed him to the people, "Ecce Homo, behold the man."